It was a muggy Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, a seasoned black law enforcement officer with over 2 decades of experience, stepped out of his car in the heart of Blue Ridge, a sleepy town nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina. The sky was low and heavy, humidity clinging to the air like a second skin. A low buzz of cicadas hummed in the background, and the scent of damp asphalt and pine needles hung thick in the atmosphere. Richard adjusted the brim of his weathered baseball cap, took a long breath, and surveyed his surroundings with a keen eye sharpened by years of quiet observation. His clothing was deliberately unassuming, a plaid flannel shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, faded jeans worn soft at the knees, and a pair of sneakers that had seen better days. Nothing about his appearance suggested authority or importance, precisely the image he intended to project. He didn't want to be seen as the new police chief this morning. He wanted to be seen as a stranger, just another black man walking through the precinct doors. That was the only way, he believed, to truly understand the reality beneath the surface. Blue Ridge had been relatively unknown outside of North Carolina until a flurry of headlines exposed troubling misconduct within its police department, racial profiling, excessive force, internal cover-ups. Those headlines were part of what drew Richard here. Not because he was looking for a challenge, he had long stopped searching for them. They seemed to find him no matter where he went. He accepted this new role knowing full well that stepping into leadership in a broken system meant walking into a hornet's nest. But he also knew that transformation required disruption. Real change never arrived quietly. The precinct's modest brick building stood ahead, flanked by a small parking lot dotted with patrol cars. Officers came and went, chatting by the side doors or sipping lukewarm coffee from styrofoam cups. Richard noted their relaxed manner, their postures loose and unguarded. No one gave him more than a passing glance. He was just another face to them. That invisibility, to him, was power. He tucked his hands into his pockets and began walking slowly toward the side entrance. Inside, the precinct buzzed with activity. Phones rang intermittently, radios crackled with background dispatch. The clatter of keyboards and low murmurs formed a kind of urban symphony Richard had long grown used to. The tiled floor gleamed too perfectly, as if an attempt to scrub away something darker still clinging beneath. The walls, painted a pale, institutional grey, were lined with bulletin boards and plaques, many of them honoring officers whose names had become synonymous with the old guard. He moved with quiet intent, not drawing attention to himself. He didn't need to. He was here to observe. That was the mission he set for himself, to see the soul of this department before it saw him. He passed a cluster of young officers huddled around a desk, laughing over a phone screen, most likely sharing some viral clip or private joke. Across the room, a senior sergeant barked orders without lifting his head, and down the corridor, a couple of beat cops were arguing mildly over a report. In all of it, Richard watched carefully, not the content of what they were doing, but the tone, the air, the culture. It didn't take long for the tone to shift. As he neared the precinct's break room, he paused, drawn by the faint smell of overcooked coffee and microwaved burritos. The corner was lively, filled with the kind of mid-morning banter that could only thrive when people felt unchallenged and unthreatened. Richard stood quietly by the doorway, not saying a word, simply observing. His stillness must have been unsettling, or perhaps it was just the timing, because a voice suddenly cut through the air with practiced arrogance. "Hey, you lost or something?" The voice was sharp, cocky, and unmistakably white. Richard turned his head slowly toward the sound, locking eyes with a tall, broad-shouldered officer whose smirk curled in disdain. The man's uniform was crisp, too crisp, as if he wore it not just with pride, but with a certain entitlement. His badge read, Officer Daniels. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. Richard didn't respond immediately. He wanted to see where this would go. Officer Daniels didn't disappoint. "This ain't a shelter, buddy," he sneered, stepping closer. "Whatever you're looking for, it ain't here." Richard remained composed, offering no reaction. The buzz of the break room quieted. A few other officers began to notice what was happening and watched with increasing interest. One leaned against the vending machine, arms folded, waiting to see the spectacle unfold. Another sipped his coffee, eyes narrowed. Nobody intervened. "You need to take that mess somewhere else," Daniels said, gesturing to Richard's clothing with a sneer. "This is a professional space." Still, Richard said nothing. His silence was not weakness, it was strategy. But Daniels, emboldened by the attention of his peers, pressed on. "I said get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." The words weren't shouted, but they struck like a slap. Behind the calm expression Richard wore, his jaw clenched. Every syllable of condescension echoed with a long history of indignity, yet he held still. Then, without warning, Officer Daniels stepped closer, bringing his face just inches from Richard's. His breath reeked of old coffee and cheap breath mints. And then it happened. Daniels spat. The warm, vile glob struck Richard's cheek and slid slowly down, catching in his beard before dripping onto the collar of his flannel shirt. The room exploded in laughter. One officer nearly doubled over, slapping the break room table. Another chortled, nudging his buddy with glee. Even those who didn't laugh wore expressions of entertained complicity. No one looked shocked, no one looked concerned. For them, this wasn't an outrage, it was amusement. It was dominance reaffirmed. Richard stood absolutely still, every nerve in his body coiled. He felt the wetness on his skin, the sting of humiliation, and the undeniable weight of history crashing against his present. He was no stranger to disrespect, but rarely had it come so brazenly and in uniform. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded white handkerchief. He wiped his face with a quiet deliberation that seemed to silence even the laughter for a moment. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" he asked softly, his voice low but perfectly clear. Daniels let out a scoff, not backing down. "Only the ones who don't belong." The laughter resumed, but this time it was more hesitant. Richard said nothing. He gave Daniels a long, cool stare, then turned away and walked down the hallway without another word. The sound of his steps echoed against the walls, each one more measured than the last. He didn't hurry. He didn't shrink. He let his silence speak louder than fury ever could. He moved not like a man who had been humiliated, but like one who had learned exactly what he came to find. And now he was ready. The moment Richard stepped away from the podium, the tension in the room could have been sliced with a blade. No one moved. It was as if the air had thickened with realization. The officers, who just minutes ago had laughed, mocked, and humiliated him, now stood frozen, some with their arms stiff at their sides, others nervously shifting their weight from foot to foot. The sound of his name, Chief Richard Nelson, still echoed in their minds like a siren, unignorable, powerful, and jolting. Daniels looked like a man who had been smacked awake from a dangerous dream. His swagger had vanished. Where arrogance once painted his features, now only panic and confusion remained. A few beads of sweat rolled from his temples to his flushed cheeks. His throat bobbed, and he opened his mouth slightly, but no words came out. Around him, those who had cheered him on were now avoiding eye contact, their once eager expressions now masked with guilt or fear. No one stepped forward to defend him. No one even reached a hand to his shoulder. He was now alone, left to bear the weight of his own actions. Richard's decision to walk in undercover was not random. It was calculated, born from years of watching how institutions hid their rot behind polished presentations. He had seen this cycle far too many times. A new leader arrives, is shown a carefully curated version of operations, hears a few rehearsed welcomes, then spends the next year slowly discovering the ugly truths buried beneath. Not this time. He had to see it raw, unfiltered, unaware. Because change, real change, doesn't come from the top down unless the top truly understands the bottom. And today he had seen it all, more than enough. After the briefing ended in tense silence, Captain Harris approached Richard with a hesitant nod. The captain, clearly caught off guard by the day's events, attempted to regain composure as he gestured toward the hallway. They walked side by side, their footsteps echoing through the now quiet precinct corridors. Harris cleared his throat. "Chief, that was unexpected," he began, not quite sure how to finish the sentence. Richard didn't respond right away. He paused at the window overlooking the parking lot, watching as a few officers filtered out, walking briskly, their heads low. "That's the point," Richard finally said, his voice low and firm. They were comfortable enough to mock, to spit, to humiliate a stranger, with no fear of consequence. That comfort ends now. Harris nodded slowly, his mouth set in a grim line. "You shook the tree, Chief. Let's see what falls out." Richard knew there was more to uncover. The incident with Daniels was not isolated. A single officer doesn't act like that unless he feels supported, encouraged even. That kind of culture grows in silence, in shadows, when leadership either doesn't care or chooses to look the other way. And Richard had no intention of being that kind of leader. He would light up every dark corner if he had to. Back in his office, Richard requested Daniels's full personnel file. He also asked for all records of internal complaints filed in the past 5 years, not just against Daniels, but across the board. As he waited, he sat at the edge of his desk, mentally retracing the events of the morning. His hands, clasped tightly, trembled with restrained fury. The spit, the mockery, the casual way they dismissed him, it wasn't just disrespect, it was a window into the soul of this department. And if this was what they did to a stranger in the building, what did they do to civilians on the street? By mid-afternoon, files began piling on his desk. Complaint forms, witness statements, summaries of disciplinary actions, or in many cases the lack thereof. One complaint stood out immediately, a civilian report accusing Officer Daniels of pinning a teenager against a squad car with unnecessary force during a traffic stop. The reason? Suspicious behavior. No contraband was found, no charges were filed. The teen was let go, shaken and in tears. The complaint had been dismissed, citing insufficient evidence, but Richard noticed that no body cam footage had ever been submitted, despite department policy. He called in Captain Harris again. "Why is there no footage for this stop?" Richard asked, tapping his finger on the report. Harris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That was one of those times Daniels said the body cam malfunctioned, said it wasn't recording." "How often do his cams malfunction?" Richard asked. Harris hesitated. "Too often." Richard leaned back. "We're going to audit every one of his stops for the past 12 months. I want timestamps, camera logs, dispatch reports, everything." The captain gave a tight nod. "Understood." Outside Richard's office, word spread quickly. The silence among the officers was no longer just awkward. It was laced with unease. Whispers echoed in the hallways. Some welcomed the change, quietly hopeful that the days of unchecked bullying might finally end. Others resented it, muttering about how things were fine before. But no one said anything out loud, not after that morning. Daniels, meanwhile, spent the afternoon sulking in the break room, staring blankly at his untouched coffee. When notified of his suspension pending investigation, he erupted, throwing the cup across the room, the contents splashing across the wall like a burst of ink. "This is political," he shouted to no one in particular. "This is reverse discrimination." But even his allies didn't rally. They kept their heads down, afraid of being next. The power structure had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The days that followed moved with a quiet urgency, like the still before a storm. Richard Nelson sat behind his office desk, sleeves rolled up, scanning pages of reports, transcripts, and bodycam logs. He wasn't just reading, he was studying a culture, tracing patterns, trying to understand the silent language of corruption, how it moves, how it hides, how it feeds on fear and compliance. He'd been in law enforcement for over 2 decades, but nothing compared to the rot he sensed here, not because it was the worst he'd ever seen, but because it was so deeply normalized. The good officers were silent, either out of fear or habit. The bad ones were bold, entitled, and untouchable. That was about to change. Outside his office, the precinct had grown quieter. The usual laughter near the vending machines, the sarcastic banter echoing through the hallways, the casual arrogance, it had all gone underground. Officers now walked with their eyes forward, cautious. They didn't know what Richard had heard or seen. They only knew one thing: the new chief didn't play by the old rules. Richard called a closed-door meeting with a select few. Officers with unblemished records, those who had once spoken up and been silenced, those whose reputations had quietly survived under the weight of dysfunction. He wasn't just cleaning house, he was rebuilding the foundation. These officers were hesitant at first, unsure if Richard was genuine or just another figurehead trying to reform on paper while preserving the same rot underneath. But the moment he told them what he had seen and heard, without flinching, without polishing the truth, they started to believe him. One of them, Officer Rachel Mendez, had tears in her eyes as she described how her complaints about misconduct had been buried by supervisors who called her too sensitive or not a team player. She had been written off, excluded from key assignments, and even transferred to patrol duties designed to make her quit. She never did. Richard listened, not as a superior, but as someone who understood what it meant to stand alone in a room full of people pretending not to see. He gave each of them a simple directive: watch, document, and report directly to him. He was creating a new channel of truth, one that bypassed the corrupt layers in between. And he promised them protection, transparency, and, most importantly, action. Meanwhile, Daniels remained suspended, pending investigation. But he wasn't idle. Word was that he'd hired a lawyer and was preparing to file a grievance, accusing the department of targeting him unfairly. Rumors swirled that he still had allies inside, officers who were quietly helping him gather evidence to discredit Richard. It was a war now, subtle but dangerous. And Richard knew the real battle wasn't just against one man. It was against a mindset. One afternoon, as Richard was reviewing body cam footage from a night shift arrest involving a young black teenager, he noticed something strange. The arrest report claimed the boy had resisted, prompting the officer to use reasonable force. But the video showed otherwise. The teenager had been calm, compliant, hands visible the entire time. Still, the officer shoved him against the hood of the car and cuffed him roughly, pressing his face into the metal despite the teen's protests. It wasn't just excessive, it was humiliating, and no one on the scene intervened. Richard paused the video and leaned back in his chair, a deep ache spreading in his chest. This wasn't just about Daniels, it was bigger. It was about a system that punished dignity, that operated under a lie that dominance equals safety. He made a note to meet the arresting officer, but first he wanted to find that boy. With the help of community outreach, Richard tracked down the teenager's mother. She was a nurse at the local hospital, working double shifts to support her family. When Richard arrived at her modest home, she answered the door with wary eyes. She wasn't used to high-ranking officers showing up at her front steps, but when he introduced himself and said he was there not to defend the officer's actions, but to understand and make things right, her guard slowly lowered. They sat in her living room, sunlight filtering through thin curtains, as she told him how her son had changed since that night. He barely slept. He jumped at sudden noises. He avoided walking alone. He had once dreamed of joining the military, of serving with honor. Now, he couldn't even look at a police badge without flinching. Richard listened silently, his jaw clenched, heart heavy. When the boy finally came downstairs, his eyes barely met Richard's. But Richard stood, extended his hand, and said, "You didn't deserve what happened to you, and I promise you, we're not all the same, not anymore." It wasn't a speech, it wasn't for show, it was a vow. When Richard returned to the precinct, he called a department-wide meeting. Every officer, every administrator, every member of staff was ordered to attend. The briefing room buzzed with low murmurs as they gathered, unsure of what was coming. Some hoped for reassurances, others braced for reprimands. Richard stepped in, his presence calm but firm. The room fell silent. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he spoke plainly. I've seen who we are when we think no one is watching. That version of this department ends today. There was no applause, just stillness. Some faces hardened. Others lowered their gaze. A few nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if relieved someone had finally said it out loud. Richard laid out a new code of accountability, mandatory bias training, random body cam audits, a civilian review board, whistleblower protections. Internal affairs would now report directly to his office. The message was clear. Silence was no longer safe. As the meeting ended, officers filed out with mixed emotions. Some felt threatened, others felt hopeful. Change is never unanimous, but it had begun. Outside the precinct, Richard stood alone on the steps, watching the city move around him. He knew this was just the beginning. Trust takes time. Culture resists change, and the fight ahead would be long. But for the first time, the department was no longer blind to itself, and that was something. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.